It was an ordinary Friday night in Alcácer, a quiet town near Valencia, Spain. Three teenagers, Miriam Garcia, 14 years old, Tony Gomez, 14 years old, and Desiree Hernandez, 15 years old, were getting ready to go out to a local disco called Cooler. The three were best friends, inseparable since childhood. They had grown up together on the same streets, had shared secrets and dreams, had planned their futures together. That night, they just wanted to dance, laugh, be teenagers enjoying a Friday night. Around 7:30 p.m., the girls left their homes. Miriam wore a denim jacket and jeans. Tony wore a pink sweater. Desiree wore her favorite clothes, feeling older, feeling free. Their parents told them to be home by midnight. Be careful, they said, as all parents do. They never imagined those would be the last words they'd say to their daughters. The girls began hitchhiking on the road connecting Alcácer with Picassent, where the disco was located. It was a common practice in rural Spain of the 1990s. Small towns were safe. People knew each other. Kids hitchhiked all the time. But that night, someone stopped. Someone who shouldn't have been on that road. Someone with intentions the girls could never have imagined. Miriam, Tony, and Desiree got into that car and disappeared into the darkness. When they didn't return home by midnight, their parents began to worry. By 1 a.m., they were frantic. By 2 a.m., they had called the police. And by sunrise, all of Alcácer knew that the three girls had disappeared. What no one knew, what no one would discover for 75 agonizing days, was that the girls were dead. They had been tortured, raped, and murdered within hours of getting into that car. And their bodies lay buried in an abandoned well just 60 kilometers away. But the story of the Alcácer girls isn't just about their murder. It's about what came after, the media circus, the conspiracy theories, the accusations of cover-up, and the questions that remain unanswered more than 3 decades later. I have to pause here because this story weighs on me. I've researched true crime cases for years, but this one is different. Not just because of the brutality, but because of how it became a spectacle, how the suffering of these girls and their families was exploited in ways that changed Spanish journalism forever. Where are you right now? Are you at home in Guadalajara, lying in bed in Barcelona, or perhaps driving through the streets of Santiago? Wherever you are, thank you for being here to listen to this story. Leave me your location in the comments. It reminds me that we're not alone in this, that we're a community trying to understand, to remember, to honor those who lost everything. If this is your first time here, you should know that this channel exists for one reason: to tell true crime stories with dignity and respect. Victims are not entertainment. They are real people whose lives mattered. If that approach resonates with you, please subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you're already part of this family, thank you. Your comment, sharing this video with someone who understands why these stories need to be told with respect. All of that keeps this work alive. Now, I have to warn you. This case involves sexual violence and torture of minors. I'll be as respectful as I can, but the facts are disturbing. If you need to pause, do so. Your mental health matters. These stories are important, but taking care of yourself is too. Let's return to Spain, November 1992. Because while the families of Miriam, Tony, and Desiree begged for information, police were about to make mistakes that would haunt this case for decades. The morning after the girls disappeared, Alcácer transformed. The town of approximately 7,000 people mobilized in a massive search. Hundreds of volunteers combed the surrounding fields, calling the girls' names, praying to find them alive. Fernando Garcia Fernandez, Miriam's father, stood before television cameras, his face a mask of anguish. "Please," he begged. "If anyone knows anything, anything at all, help us bring our girls home." His voice broke. His hands trembled. You could see in his eyes that he already knew on some deep, instinctive level that something terrible had happened. The Guardia Civil, Spain's national police, established a task force. But from the beginning, there were problems. The investigation was chaotic, disorganized. Different police agencies worked on the same leads without coordination. Evidence was contaminated. Witnesses were interviewed multiple times by different officers, their statements becoming contradictory as details blurred. And critically, the first days, when leads are freshest, when witnesses remember most clearly, were wasted following false leads. Someone reported seeing the girls at a bus station. Police spent days investigating, only to discover it was a case of mistaken identity. Another witness claimed to have seen them get into a white car. Then another said it was a dark car. A third insisted it was a van. Police chased all these leads simultaneously, diluting their resources. Meanwhile, in an abandoned well called La Romana, 60 kilometers away, the bodies of Miriam, Tony, and Desiree lay buried beneath dirt and rubble. They had been tortured for hours. They had been raped repeatedly. They had been murdered and disposed of like garbage. And their killers were free, watching the media circus, knowing they had gotten away with it. What happened next in Spanish media was unprecedented and, for many, unforgivable. The case of the Alcácer girls became the biggest media event in Spanish history up to that point. Every television channel, every newspaper, every radio station covered the story nonstop. But it wasn't just news coverage. It became entertainment. Television programs held daily specials about the case. They brought in psychics who claimed to know where the girls were. They brought in self-proclaimed criminologists who speculated endlessly about what might have happened to them. They brought in the families and interviewed them over and over, capturing every tear, every moment of anguish, broadcasting it to millions. One program, hosted by a journalist named Nieves Herrero, became particularly notorious. Every night, millions of Spaniards tuned in to watch the latest updates, the latest theories, the latest heartbreaking emotions from the families. Psychics appeared on national television, claiming visions of where the girls were. "I can see them," they'd say, closing their eyes dramatically. "They're in an old building," or "they're near water," or "I can feel they're still alive." The families, desperate for any hope, believed these people. They organized searches based on psychic visions. They spent their meager resources chasing leads that didn't exist. And the police, instead of controlling the situation, instead of protecting the integrity of their investigation, allowed all of this to happen. In some cases, they even encouraged it, sharing investigation details with reporters, allowing cameras to film crime scenes. It was a spectacle, a horror turned into entertainment. And it set a precedent for crime journalism in Spain that still resonates today. January 27, 1993. It had been 75 days since the girls disappeared. 75 days of searches, of fading hopes, of families clinging to the possibility that their daughters might still be alive. Then, a beekeeper named Ramon Garcia, looking for a place for his hives, noticed something strange near an abandoned well in La Romana. There were signs of recent digging. The earth had been disturbed, then poorly covered. He called the Guardia Civil. And when officers began to dig, they found what all of Spain had been dreading: the bodies of Miriam Garcia, Tony Gomez, and Desiree Hernandez. The girls had been buried in shallow graves inside the abandoned well. They had been left naked, their clothes removed, their bodies showing signs of terrible abuse. The autopsy would reveal horrors that no parent should have to hear. The girls had been subjected to brutal sexual violence. They had been tortured, burned with cigarettes, beaten, mutilated. The suffering they endured in their final hours was unimaginable. The cause of death was asphyxiation. The killers had strangled them, one by one, and left them to die in that dark, abandoned well. But here's what enraged Spain. The autopsy showed that the girls had died within the first 24 hours of their disappearance. While the entire nation searched for them, while psychics claimed they were alive somewhere, while families clung to hope, the girls were already dead, buried in that well. 75 days of searching, 75 days of false hope, 75 days of media circus. And all the while, the girls were dead, their bodies just 60 kilometers from home. The Guardia Civil acted quickly after the bodies were found. They had leads, witness testimonies, forensic evidence from the disposal site, behavioral patterns that pointed to a certain type of criminal. On January 28th, 1993, just one day after the bodies were found, they arrested two men, Antonio Angles Martins and Miguel Riquet Tarrega. Angles, 27 years old, had a criminal history that should have raised immediate alarms. He had been arrested for rape, robbery, assault. He was known in his hometown of Cattarauja as violent, unpredictable, dangerous. Riquet, 32 years old, was Angles' brother-in-law. He was less violent than Angles but had his own criminal history of petty theft and assault. Police were also looking for a third man, Angles' brother Enrique Angles, but he provided an alibi that was accepted. The investigation focused on Antonio Angles and Miguel Riquet. Miguel Riquet confessed almost immediately. He described in graphic detail how he and Angles had picked up the girls hitchhiking. They had taken them to the abandoned well. They had tortured and raped them for hours. They had murdered them and buried them. Riquet's confession was detailed, specific, and absolutely horrific. He described who did what. He described how the girls had begged for their lives. He described the final moments of each girl. It was compelling evidence. Too compelling, some would later argue, because there were aspects of Riquet's confession that didn't add up, details that contradicted forensic evidence, claims that seemed designed to minimize his own role while maximizing Angles. But police had their confession. They had their man. Or at least they had one of them, because Antonio Angles had disappeared. This is where the case becomes even more controversial. Antonio Angles, the alleged mastermind behind the murders, the more violent of the two, managed to evade capture for days after the bodies were found. Police knew they were looking for him. They knew he was dangerous, yet somehow he managed to remain hidden, moving through Spain undetected. On January 29, 1993, 2 days after the bodies were found, Angles appeared at the port of Valencia. He boarded a cargo ship called the City of Plymouth, which was headed to Dublin, Ireland. How did he manage to board the ship without being detected? The port should have been under surveillance. His photograph had been distributed to all law enforcement. Yet somehow he got onto that ship. The official explanation is that he stowed away in a cargo container. But many questioned how a fugitive could navigate a secure port, find the right ship, and hide himself without help. Once aboard, Angles allegedly hid during the 4-day voyage to Dublin. When the ship arrived in Ireland on February 1, 1993, he's believed to have escaped. And then, he disappeared completely, despite a massive search by Interpol. Despite reported sightings in Ireland, Portugal, Italy, Brazil, and dozens of other countries, Antonio Angles was never found. Officially, he was declared dead in 2013, 20 years after the murders, based on the assumption that he had died while on the ship or shortly after reaching Ireland. But many don't believe this. Many believe Angles received help from family, from unknown accomplices, perhaps even from people within law enforcement. They believe he's alive somewhere, living under a false identity, having escaped justice for one of the most notorious crimes in Spanish history. Miguel Riquet's trial began in September 1997, more than 4 years after the murders. It was one of the most publicized trials in Spanish history, with constant media coverage and public protests outside the courthouse. The prosecution presented an overwhelming case. They had Riquet's confession. They had forensic evidence linking him to the disposal site. They had witness testimony placing him in the area the day the girls disappeared. Riquet's defense argued that he had been coerced by Antonio Angles, that he was too afraid to disobey, that his participation was minimal. They portrayed Riquet as a victim of Angles too, a weak man controlled by a more powerful monster. But the evidence told a different story. Forensic testimony suggested Riquet had actively participated in the tortures and murders. The details in his confession, though he later tried to recant it, showed intimate knowledge of the crimes. The victims' families attended the trial every day. They sat in the courtroom, forcing themselves to listen to horrific details of how their daughters had suffered, looking directly at the man who had helped kill them. Fernando Garcia, Miriam's father, testified about the impact his daughter's loss had on his family. "She was our light. he said, tears streaming down his face. She had her whole life ahead of her, and this man took it from her for... Why? For pleasure? For fun? On September 23, 1997, the verdict was delivered. Miguel Riquet was found guilty on 3 counts of murder, rape, and kidnapping. He was sentenced to 170 years in prison, the harshest sentences allowed under Spanish law at the time. But under Spanish law, the maximum time anyone can actually serve is 40 years, regardless of sentence. Which meant that Riquet, if he lived long enough, would eventually be released. And Antonio Angles was still free. Chapter 9. The questions that won't go away. From the moment the bodies were found, questions arose about the official investigation. And as years passed, those questions only grew louder, more insistent. First question: how could Antonio Angles, a known criminal whose photograph was being shown on every news channel, board a cargo ship at a port that was supposedly under surveillance? The official explanation that he stowed away has never satisfied many. Ports have security. Cargo ships have crews. How could someone hide for 4 days without being discovered? Did he receive help? And from whom? Second question: why didn't police search more thoroughly in the first hours and days? The La Romana site where the bodies were found was within the initial search area. Volunteers passed near it, but no one checked it carefully until 75 days later. Why? Third question: were more people involved than those who were arrested? Some witnesses reported seeing 4 men in the car that picked up the girls. Not 2. Angles' brother, Enrique, provided an alibi, but some people questioned its validity. Were there other accomplices who were never investigated? Fourth question: was there a cover-up? This is the most controversial question. Some believe that people in positions of power, local politicians, police officers, businessmen, were involved in the murders or helped cover them up. They point to inconsistencies in the investigation, evidence that disappeared, witnesses who weren't properly questioned. Fifth question: what about the snuff films? Rumors persisted for years that the murders had been filmed, that videos of the tortures and rapes existed, that they were being sold on the black market for pornography. Police denied this categorically, but the rumors never completely died. These questions have fueled decades of conspiracy theories, documentaries, investigative books, and public debate, and they've never been satisfactorily answered. The Alcácer girls' case became fertile ground for conspiracy theories ranging from the plausible to the absolutely fantastic. The pornography network theory. This theory suggests that Angles and Riquet didn't act alone, but were part of an organized network that produced child pornography and snuff films. According to this theory, the girls were specifically targeted, the murders were filmed, and powerful people paid for access to these videos. Proponents of this theory point to the organized nature of the crimes, the prolonged time the girls were kept alive, Angles' apparently easy escape, witness testimony claiming to have seen filming equipment in the area, persistent rumors of videos circulating in black markets, the political cover-up theory. This theory argues that local or regional political figures were involved in the murders or in covering them up. It suggests the investigation was deliberately sabotaged to protect powerful people. Evidence cited includes the chaotic and inefficient investigation, Angles' escape, witnesses who claimed to have been threatened to stay quiet, forensic evidence that disappeared, lines of investigation that were closed without explanation, the ritual crime theory. Some more extreme theories suggested the murders were ritual crimes, possibly connected to satanic cults or secret societies. These theories generally cited the specific nature of the tortures and the disposal of the bodies. The official explanation: police and prosecutors maintained it was exactly what it appeared to be. 2 violent criminals who saw an opportunity, kidnapped 3 girls, tortured and raped them for pleasure, and murdered them. No broader conspiracy, no organized network, just opportunistic predators. The debate between these theories continues to this day. Television programs, podcasts, books, documentaries, all explore different angles, presenting new evidence or reinterpreting old evidence. One figure stood out in the investigation of the Alcácer case: investigative journalist Juan Ignacio Blanco. He devoted years of his life to investigating the case, accumulating thousands of pages of documents, interviewing hundreds of witnesses, challenging the official narrative at every point. Blanco believed there was a broader conspiracy. He argued that the police investigation was incompetent at best and criminally negligent at worst. He pointed to dozens of inconsistencies, unfollowed leads, ignored witnesses. His work was controversial. Critics accused him of being a conspiracy theorist, of exploiting tragedy for fame, of giving false hope to the victims' families. Supporters saw him as one of the few willing to ask hard questions, to challenge authorities, to fight for truth. Blanco documented witness testimony from people who claimed to have seen the girls after they were supposedly murdered. He found inconsistencies in the official timeline. He questioned the forensic evidence that linked only Engels and Rickett to the crimes. He wrote books, appeared on television programs, maintained websites dedicated to the case. His investigation profoundly influenced how the Spanish public viewed the case. But he also paid a price. He was sued, threatened, harassed. Some witnesses refused to speak with him out of fear of reprisals. Authorities dismissed him as a nuisance. Juan Ignacio Blanco died in 2013 at the age of 62, never having seen the complete answers he sought. But his work ensured that the Alcácer case would never be forgotten, that the questions would never stop being asked. The Alcácer girls case fundamentally changed Spanish journalism. The media coverage of the case, particularly in its first months, was so excessive, so exploitative, so damaging that it led to a national rethinking of journalistic ethics. The television programs that had turned tragedy into entertainment faced public backlash. The psychics who had appeared on national television claiming to know where the girls were widely condemned. The journalists who had relentlessly interviewed grieving families were criticized. In response, Spanish media organizations implemented new ethical guidelines, limitations on interviewing victims' families, prohibitions on showing graphic images from crime scenes, restrictions on reporting about minors involved in crimes, greater scrutiny of claims from self-proclaimed experts. The case also led to changes in how police interacted with media. The Guardia Civil was criticized for allowing journalists to compromise the investigation, for sharing too much information too soon, for allowing the case to become a media circus. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on public consciousness. Spaniards who had watched the coverage became more skeptical of media, more aware of how tragedy could be exploited for ratings, more critical of sensationalist journalism. The Alcácer case became shorthand in Spain for everything that can go wrong when media loses sight of its responsibility to victims in pursuit of spectacle. While the nation debated conspiracy theories and media ethics, three families dealt with a loss that could never be adequately expressed. Fernando Garcia, Miriam's father, became the public face of the family's grief. He spoke at press conferences, accepted interviews, became an advocate for victims' rights. But the personal cost was immense. His marriage didn't survive the strain. His health deteriorated. He lived with the weight of knowing exactly how his daughter had suffered in her final hours. Tony's parents, Juan and Maria Gomez, withdrew from public view. They couldn't bear the constant reminder, the cameras, the questions. They tried to rebuild their lives in private to find some path forward. But the loss of their daughter defined them, a grief that never diminished. Desiree's parents, Manuel and Nieves Hernandez, struggled with anger in addition to grief. Anger at the killers, anger at the system that had failed them, anger at the media that had exploited their daughter's death. Manuel became a vocal critic of how the case was handled, demanding answers that never came. All three families had to live in a world where their daughters became national symbols instead of just being their girls, where strangers debated theories about how their daughters died, where the entertainment industry profited from their tragedy, and they had to live knowing that one of the men who killed their daughters, Antonio Engels, never faced justice, that he might be alive somewhere, free, while their girls lay in graves. For more than 2 decades, the search for Antonio Engels continued. Reported sightings came from around the world: Ireland, Portugal, Italy, Brazil, Argentina, even as far as Japan. Every few years, a new sighting would be reported. Someone would see a man who looked like Engels. Police would investigate. Media would report that perhaps, finally, they had found Spain's most wanted fugitive. But every lead turned out to be false. Every sighting was a case of mistaken identity or a deliberate hoax. In 2013, Spanish authorities made a controversial decision. They officially declared Antonio Engels dead. They based this on testimony from crew members of the city of Plymouth, who claimed he had been aboard the ship but had disappeared at some point during the voyage. The official theory is that Engels fell from the ship, either accidentally or by suicide, and drowned in the Irish Sea. His body was never found, but authorities concluded he couldn't have survived. But many reject this conclusion. The victims' families don't believe it. Investigative journalists don't believe it. Even some within law enforcement privately question it, because declaring Engels dead conveniently closes the case. It allows authorities to say that those responsible are either dead or in prison. It allows for closure, regardless of whether that closure is based on truth. In 2019, the Spanish television program, Equipo de Investigación, presented evidence suggesting Engels might be alive and living in Ireland. They showed photographs of a man who bore a striking resemblance to an age-progressed image of Engels. They traced his potential route from Dublin port to a rural Irish community. Spanish police investigated but found no conclusive evidence. The man in the photographs denied being Engels. Without definitive proof, no DNA, no fingerprints, no confession, the case remains unresolved. Antonio Engels officially dead, but possibly maybe alive somewhere. On June 21, 2013, Miguel Riquet was released from prison after serving 19 years of his sentence. Under Spanish law, he had accumulated enough good behavior credits to qualify for early release. News of his release sparked outrage across Spain. The victims' families were devastated. "How can the man who tortured and murdered our daughters walk free?" asked Fernando Garcia at an emotional press conference. "Where is the justice?" Protests erupted in Valencia. Hundreds of people marched demanding that Riquet remain imprisoned. Petitions were signed. Politicians issued statements. But legally, there was nothing to be done. Under existing law, Riquet had served his time. Riquet was released under strict conditions. He was required to register regularly with police. He was prohibited from contact with the victims' families. He had restrictions placed on his movements. He initially moved to Portugal, trying to escape Spanish media attention. But his identity was quickly discovered, and he faced harassment there too. He returned to Spain and reportedly lived somewhere under carefully controlled conditions. In 2018, Riquet gave a rare interview to a Spanish journalist. He expressed remorse for the crimes but continued to insist he had been coerced by Antonio Engels. "I was too afraid to stop him," he claimed. "Engels was a monster. If I had refused to participate, he would have killed me too." Critics point out that in 1992, Riquet was a 32-year-old man, older, larger, and supposedly stronger than the 27-year-old Engels. The claim that he was completely powerless to resist has never been convincing to many. The victims' families rejected his remorse as self-serving and inadequate. "I'm sorry" doesn't bring their daughters back. "I was afraid" doesn't excuse the torture and murder of 3 innocent girls. Miguel Riquet lives. Miriam, Tony, and Desiree do not. Of all the conspiracy theories surrounding the Alcácer case, none has persisted more tenaciously than claims that snuff films were made, videos of the tortures and murders, and sold on black market pornography markets. Police have consistently denied that such videos exist. They've stated they searched exhaustively and found no evidence of filming equipment, videos, or distribution networks, but the rumors have never died. They began almost immediately after the bodies were found and have circulated in one form or another for 3 decades. Some witnesses claimed to have seen filming equipment in the La Romana area around the time of the murders. Others claimed to have seen videos being offered for sale. Some even claimed to have viewed them. Investigative journalists have pursued these leads for years. Some claim to have found evidence of a network that produced and distributed extreme violent pornography, including snuff films. Others dismiss it as urban moral panic, no different from snuff pornography stories that have circulated for decades without verifiable evidence. The challenge is that by their nature, if such videos existed, they would be among the most secretive materials in the criminal world. Those involved in their production or distribution would never admit their existence. Buyers would never come forward, and without an actual video in the hands of authorities, it's impossible to prove or disprove their existence. What's undeniable is that the nature of the murders, the prolonged time the girls were kept alive, the specific and ritual torture, the careful disposal of the bodies, suggests a level of planning and organization beyond simple opportunistic crime. Whether this indicates the existence of actual videos or simply reflects the fantasies of sadistic predators is a question that will likely never be definitively answered. The Alcácer girls' case left scars on Spanish society that remain visible more than 3 decades later. For parents throughout Spain, the case was a terrifying wake-up call. In 1992, it was common for teenagers to hitchhike, to walk home alone at night, to have the kind of freedom that now seems recklessly dangerous. After Alcácer, that innocence vanished. Parents became more protective, more cautious. Children lost freedoms that previous generations had enjoyed. Fear became a constant. Fear of strangers, fear of letting children out of sight, fear that what happened to Miriam, Tony, and Desiree could happen to any child. The case also exposed flaws in the Spanish judicial system. The early release of violent criminals, the limited maximum sentence regardless of how serious the crimes, the apparent ease with which fugitives could evade capture, all these problems were underscored by the Alcácer case. Reforms followed, but never quickly or comprehensively enough to satisfy those who felt the system had failed catastrophically. The case also transformed how Spaniards viewed media. The blatant exploitation of tragedy, the sensationalism, the endless parade of psychics and self-proclaimed experts. All this led a generation to be more skeptical of what they saw on television, more critical of how news was told. And for those in the small town of Alcácer, the impact was particularly profound. Their town, once known only for its citrus fields and quiet rural life, became synonymous with one of the most horrific crimes in Spanish history. Forevermore, they would be the town where the 3 girls died. More than 30 years later, the fundamental questions about the Alcácer case remain unanswered. Is Antonio Angles alive or dead? If alive, where is he? How did he manage to evade capture for so long? Did he receive help, and from whom? Did Miguel Riquet tell the truth about his level of participation? Was he really coerced by Angles, or was he an equal participant? Was his confession complete and accurate, or was he protecting others? Were more people involved besides Angles and Riquet? What about the witnesses who reported seeing 4 men in the car? What about Angles' brother, whose alibi was never thoroughly verified? Was the investigation incompetent, or was there a deliberate cover-up? Why were so many leads not followed? Why did evidence disappear? Why were witnesses ignored? Were snuff films made? Was this part of an organized network of violent pornography? Or were they simply opportunistic criminals who saw 3 vulnerable girls and acted on their predatory impulses? Every question leads to more questions. Every answer raises new doubts. And after 3 decades, the truth seems more elusive than ever. What is known with certainty is limited. 3 innocent girls were kidnapped, tortured, and murdered. Miguel Riquet was convicted and served time, though many feel it wasn't enough. Antonio Angles escaped justice, either because he's dead or because he managed to flee and hide. The investigation was deeply flawed, allowing evidence to be lost and leads to go cold. Media exploited the tragedy in ways that changed Spanish journalism. The families never received complete justice or closure. Beyond these basic facts, almost everything is debatable, questionable, uncertain. It's important, amid all the conspiracy theories and debate about media ethics and police competence, to remember who Miriam Garcia, Tony Gomez, and Desiree Hernandez really were. They weren't just victims. They weren't just a famous case. They were real girls with real lives, with families who loved them, with dreams about their futures. Miriam was 14 years old. She loved to dance. She wanted to be a hairdresser. She was known for her laughter, her kindness, how she always included everyone. Her friends remembered her as the one who kept the group together, the one who made everyone feel welcome. Toni was also 14 years old. She was quiet, thoughtful, loved to read. She dreamed of traveling, of seeing the world beyond her small town. Her teachers remembered her as a diligent student who always did her work, who treated everyone with respect. Desiree was 15 years old. She was the leader of the group, the confident one, the one who planned their adventures. She wanted to study medicine to help people. Her family remembered her as brave, determined, someone who knew what she wanted and pursued her goals. They were three normal girls from a normal small town. Their crime was wanting to go dancing on a Friday night. Their mistake was trusting the wrong people. They deserved long lives filled with love, laughter, achievements. They deserved to grow up, go to college, fall in love, have careers, maybe their own families. They deserved all the ordinary experiences that make up a well-lived life. Instead, their lives were brutally cut short at 14 and 15 years old, and their deaths became a national spectacle. Their suffering exploited for ratings, their names forever associated with one of Spain's most notorious crimes. But those who knew them refused to let them be defined only by how they died. They insist on remembering how they lived, as bright, loving girls with all the potential in the world. As we reach the end of this story, I need you to understand something. There's no real closure here. No neat resolution. Just questions, grief, and the weight of injustice. Antonio Angles, alive or dead, never faced trial. Miguel Ricketts served less than 20 years for helping to torture and murder three girls. The families never got the answers they deserved. And the complete truth, what really happened that night, who else might have been involved, whether there was a broader conspiracy, remains buried under layers of incompetence, possible corruption, and decades of speculation. The Alcácer girls' case stands as a reminder of how systems can fail, of how tragedy can be exploited, of how justice sometimes simply doesn't arrive. But it also stands as a reminder of why these stories must be told. Not for entertainment, not for sensationalism, but to remember, to honor, to ensure that Miriam, Toni, and Desiree are not forgotten. As you prepare for sleep tonight, listening to the rain, think about three girls who just wanted to dance. Think about how it should have been an ordinary night, music, laughter, the simple joy of being young. Think about their families, who have lived for more than 30 years with grief that never diminishes, with questions that have never been answered, with justice that was never fully served. Think about how fragile safety is, how quickly joy can continue 47 aim turned to tragedy, how important it is that the institutions designed to protect the vulnerable actually do their job. The small town of Alcácer has a memorial for the three girls. On the anniversary of their disappearance each year, people still come to leave flowers, to remember, to ensure they're never forgotten. Because that's what we can do. When justice fails, when answers remain elusive, when the system falls short, we can remember. We can honor. We can say their names. Miriam Garcia, Toni Gomez, Desiree Hernandez. Three girls who deserved better. Three lives that mattered. Three futures stolen by inconceivable violence. Rest in peace, girls. Your story has been told with the respect it deserves. And though complete justice may never come, you will never, never be forgotten. On the cold morning of May 4th, 1932, Stockholm awoke without knowing that this day would forever change the way its inhabitants would sleep at night. The city, covered by a thick fog that clung to the cobblestone streets, held a macabre secret in one of its oldest neighborhoods. A secret that would soon become Sweden's most terrifying nightmare. Where are you right now? What time is it where you are? If you're looking to relax with true crime stories while listening to the rain, you've come to the right place. Subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications, like this video and share it with someone who loves unsolved mysteries. Your support helps us continue bringing the most chilling cases in history. Mrs. Minnie Nielsen, a 55-year-old woman known for her obsessive punctuality, had not opened her small textile shop that morning. Her neighbors, puzzled by this unusual behavior, decided to investigate. What they found in her apartment in the Atlas building would be so disturbing that some of them would never be the same. The door was ajar, and from the hallway they could perceive something none of them expected to find. Mr. Eric Anderson, the building's baker, was the first to enter Minnie's apartment. The scene that greeted him made him immediately step back. His face lost all color, and his hands began to tremble uncontrollably. Minnie Nielsen lay in her bed, but she wasn't simply dead. Her body presented something that investigators had never seen in all of Sweden's criminal history. The corpse had been completely drained of blood. Every drop of blood had been extracted from her body with surgical precision that suggested advanced medical knowledge. But the most disturbing thing wasn't the absence of blood, but the way it had been removed. There were no signs of struggle, no disorder in the room, and the expression on Minnie's face was one of absolute peace, as if she had been sleeping when it happened. How was it possible for someone to perform such an act without the victim waking up or resisting? Stockholm police arrived within minutes, but what they found left them completely baffled. On the nightstand, next to Minnie's bed, there was a soup spoon stained with dried blood. An ordinary spoon, the kind anyone would have in their kitchen, but in that context it acquired a sinister meaning that no one could explain. What this spoon revealed about the killer was something that not even the most experienced detectives were prepared to understand. Inspector Anders Lindqvist, a Stockholm police veteran with over 20 years of experience, had seen his share of violent crimes. He had investigated crimes of passion, robberies gone wrong, even some poisoning cases. But nothing, absolutely nothing in his career had prepared him for this. As he examined Minnie Nielsen's body, a feeling of unease began to take hold of him. The coroner, Dr. Gustav Carlson, performed the autopsy that same afternoon. His findings were so baffling that he requested a second opinion from 2 colleagues before presenting his official report. Minnie's body contained less than 10% of the blood that an adult human should have. The veins and arteries were collapsed, as if something or someone had methodically sucked every drop of blood from her circulatory system. There were no significant external wounds, only 2 small marks on the neck, almost imperceptible. 2 small marks on the neck, separated by exactly 3 centimeters. Perfectly symmetrical. Dr. Carlson, a man of science who didn't believe in superstitions, found himself thinking about something he never imagined he would seriously consider. The marks were identical to the descriptions he had read in old European legends about creatures of the night. But the scientific explanation he was about to discover would be even more terrifying. News of the murder spread through Stockholm like wildfire. The newspapers, hungry for a sensational story, began publishing increasingly dramatic headlines. The Atlas vampire strikes, proclaimed Aftonbladet on its front page. Death by exsanguination in the heart of Stockholm, declared Svenska Dagbladet. The city, normally calm and orderly, began to sink into a state of collective panic. Inspector Lindqvist called an emergency meeting with his team. In the central station's conference room, he spread out all the evidence on a long table. The blood-stained spoon, photographs of the body, the autopsy report, witness testimonies from neighbors. Every piece of the puzzle was there, but none fit logically. It was as if they were trying to solve a crime that defied the laws of reality. Gentlemen, Lindqvist began, his deep voice resonating in the silent room. We are facing a killer with advanced medical knowledge, access to surgical instruments, and a methodology so precise that he left practically no forensic evidence. He paused, his eyes scanning the faces of his detectives. But there's something else. Something none of you want to admit, but that you're all thinking. What he was about to say would divide his team and change the course of the entire investigation. While the police worked on scientific and rational theories, the residents of the Atlas building had their own explanations. Mrs. Bergstrom, a 70-year-old woman who lived on the top floor, claimed to have heard strange sounds the night of the murder. They weren't footsteps or voices, but something she described as a liquid whisper, a sound she had never heard before and that had kept her awake all night. Young Lars Eriksson, a medical student who occupied the apartment adjacent to Minnie's, revealed a disturbing detail to the police. 3 days before the murder, he had seen a tall, thin man, dressed in a long black coat, leaving the Atlas building near midnight. What caught his attention was that the man walked with an unnatural grace, almost floating over the steps, and when he briefly turned his face toward Lars, his eyes seemed to reflect the moonlight in a way that wasn't completely human. Lars's description was so specific and detailed that Inspector Lindqvist ordered a forensic artist to create a portrait of the suspect. When the drawing was finished, something extraordinary happened. Mrs. Bergstrom, upon seeing the portrait, visibly paled and began to tremble. "That man," she whispered with a broken voice. "I saw that same man 20 years ago during the last unsolved exsanguination case in Stockholm, and he hasn't aged a single day." What the police archives revealed about that old case would make the entire team question what they knew about reality. In the depths of Stockholm's municipal archives, covered by 2 decades of dust and oblivion, Inspector Lindqvist found a file that would change everything. The 1912 case had been filed as death by unknown causes, but the details were disturbingly similar. A middle-aged woman, found in her apartment, completely drained of blood, with 2 small marks on her neck. The case was never solved. What made the inspector's breath catch was the photograph attached to the file. At the 1912 crime scene, investigators had photographed the onlookers who had gathered outside the building. Among the crowd, clearly visible in the blurry but identifiable image, was the same man from the portrait that Lars Eriksson had described. The same angular face, the same piercing eyes, the same thin build. 20 years later, showing not a day of aging. Lindqvist immediately called Dr. Carlson to show him the file. Both men, sitting in the inspector's office under the dim light of a desk lamp, faced an impossible reality. "Anders," said the coroner with a trembling voice, "there are things in this world that science still cannot explain. I've spent my entire life studying the human body, and I can tell you with certainty that what was done to Minnie Nielsen requires more than medical knowledge." He paused, carefully choosing his next words. "It requires something I never thought I would say out loud." But before he could finish his sentence, the phone on the inspector's desk began to ring urgently, bringing news that would confirm their worst fears. It was Sergeant Olson on the phone, his voice altered by panic. "Inspector, you need to come immediately to the Visastan district. There's another body. Same characteristics. Complete exsanguination." Lindqvist's heart sank. He had feared this moment since they found Minnie Nielsen. A killer who murders in this way doesn't stop with a single victim. The second victim was Helena Johansson, a 32-year-old nurse who lived alone in a modest apartment just 10 blocks from the Atlas building. The scene was an almost exact replica of the first murder. The body in the bed, the peaceful expression, the 2 marks on the neck, and next to the nightstand, another spoon stained with blood. But this time there was something different, something that made Inspector Lindqvist feel a chill run down his spine. On Helena's bedroom mirror, written with what appeared to be blood, there was a message. Only 3 words in Old Swedish: "De noche vengo," "I come at night." The handwriting was elegant, almost artistic, executed with a precision that suggested the killer had taken his time. There was no rush, no fear of being discovered. It was as if he wanted them to know he would strike again, and that there was nothing they could do to stop him. The handwriting analysis would reveal something that would take the investigation in a direction no one had anticipated. The graphological analysis of the message was sent to Professor Magnus Lindström, an expert in historical calligraphy from Uppsala University. His response arrived 2 days later, and it was as baffling as the case itself. The writing was not only in Old Swedish, but used a specific form of calligraphy that had been in use during the 17th century. More specifically, it was the style used by nobles and the educated class during the era of the Swedish Empire. "It's impossible," the professor wrote in his report, "for anyone in modern Sweden to write this way without extensive and dedicated study of historical texts. The strokes, the pen pressure, even the angle of inclination, everything corresponds to writing techniques that disappeared more than 200 years ago. But there was more. The chemical analysis of the blood used to write the message revealed that it didn't belong to Helena Johansson. It belonged to Minnie Nielsen, the first victim. This meant that the killer had preserved the blood of his first victim for several days, keeping it liquid and usable. To achieve this, he would need very specific storage conditions and possibly anticoagulants. Dr. Carlson explained to the team that keeping blood fresh outside the body for that long without modern medical equipment was almost impossible. Unless, he added with a somber voice, the killer has a method we don't know, a technique that has remained hidden for centuries. The investigation was about to take a turn toward the supernatural, but what they would discover in the church archives would prepare them to face an even darker truth. Following a hunch he couldn't rationally explain, Inspector Lindqvist visited the old Ridderholm Church, one of Stockholm's oldest constructions. He asked Father Johannes Lundberg for access to the parish's historical records, specifically those related to unexplained deaths during the 17th and 18th centuries. The elderly priest looked at him with an expression that mixed understanding and fear. "I knew someone would come asking sooner or later," said Father Lundberg as he guided him through stone corridors to an underground room. The archives were stored on old wooden shelves, protected from the passage of time by the cold, dry air of the basement. There are stories in these books that the church decided not to share publicly. Stories that question everything we think we know about good and evil. Father Lundberg extracted a particularly old volume, its pages yellowed and fragile. He carefully opened it to a section marked with a red ribbon. There, in an entry dated October 15, 1692, there was a record of several unexplained deaths in the Gamla Stan district. The victims had been found drained of blood, with marks on their necks, and local residents had reported the presence of a tall man dressed in black who disappeared into the shadows. The suspect's name was clearly written in the margin: the noble Alaric von Fersen, upon whom suspicions of dark practices weigh. What happened to von Fersen, according to the records, would make the entire case take a turn toward the impossible. The church records contained something that no modern police file would include: an official exorcism. The noble Alaric von Fersen had been subjected to an exorcism ritual on November 3, 1692, carried out by 3 bishops and documented with meticulous detail. According to the record, von Fersen had confessed under ecclesiastical pressure that he had been drinking the vital essence of the innocent to prolong his earthly existence beyond natural limits. What was most disturbing was what came after. The exorcism apparently failed. Von Fersen escaped during the ritual, killing 2 guards in the process. The last record about him dated from November 15, 1692. The demon von Fersen has fled into the shadows. May God protect the innocent from his eternal thirst. His crimes will continue until he is purified by divine light or completely destroyed. Inspector Lindqvist photographed every relevant page of the archives. As he did so, Father Lundberg revealed something else to him. "Inspector, there is a secret society in Stockholm, formed in the 18th century with the sole purpose of tracking and documenting von Fersen's appearances. They've never been able to capture him, but they maintain records of every suspicious death that matches his method. If he has truly returned, they will know." The priest handed him a card with a handwritten address. "Go tonight. Ask for the Brotherhood of Eternal Light. They have answers that the police will never find." What the inspector would discover at that secret meeting would force him to make a decision that could cost him his career, or even his life. The address on the card led to an old bookstore in the Gamla Stan district, Stockholm's historic heart. At 11 p.m., just as Father Lundberg had instructed him, Inspector Lindqvist knocked on the back door of the shop. A man about 60 years old, with a gray beard and penetrating eyes, opened without asking questions. "We were expecting you, Inspector. Please, follow me." The back room of the bookstore was much larger than it appeared from outside. The walls were covered with old maps of Stockholm, each marked with red XS in different locations. There was a long table in the center, surrounded by 8 people of different ages. They all looked at him with a mixture of solemnity and expectation. The man who had received him introduced himself as Karl Sundström, leader of the Brotherhood of Eternal Light. "Inspector Lindqvist," Sundström began, "our organization has existed for 240 years with a single purpose: to document and, if possible, stop Alaric von Fersen. Each generation of our Brotherhood has inherited this mission, and each generation has failed. He paused, pointing to the maps on the walls. Each red X marks a place where von Fersen has killed. There are 87 marks on these maps. 87 lives taken over nearly 3 centuries. And now, Inspector, 2 more have just been added. Sundström slid a thick folder across the table. This is everything we know about him. But there's something you must understand before opening that folder. Once you know the complete truth, there will be no turning back. Your vision of reality will change forever. The inspector, with trembling hands, opened the folder and began to read a horror that would challenge everything he believed. Inside the folder were documents dating from 1692 to 1932, meticulously organized and preserved. The Brotherhood had tracked every known appearance of von Fersen, and there was a clear pattern. He killed in cycles of approximately 20 years, taking between 2 and 5 victims in each cycle before disappearing again into the shadows. The last cycle before 1932 had been in 1912, exactly 20 years earlier. But there was more in the documents. The Brotherhood had collected testimonies from survivors, people who had encountered von Fersen but whom, for some reason, he had spared. These testimonies painted a terrifying picture of the immortal noble. Von Fersen didn't kill out of necessity, but for pleasure. He carefully selected his victims, studying them for days before attacking. He was intelligent, cultured, and completely devoid of human empathy. "There's something else you should know," said Sundström, pointing to a specific section of the documents. "Von Fersen cannot be killed by conventional methods. The Brotherhood has tried 3 times in its history. In 1723, a group of our predecessors managed to corner him in an abandoned house and tried to burn him alive. The house was reduced to ashes, but von Fersen escaped unharmed. In 1809, they tried to decapitate him. The sword broke before touching his neck. In 1876, they tried to drown him in the Melleren. He emerged from the water after being submerged for more than 20 minutes, laughing. Sundström looked directly into the inspector's eyes. "But there is a weakness. A single method that, according to our research, might work." What he was about to reveal sounded like something out of old legends, but it was the only hope they had. Sundström got up from the table and walked toward a locked cabinet in the corner of the room. He opened it carefully and extracted a wooden box carved with strange symbols. When he opened it, Inspector Lindqvist saw something he never expected to see in civilian hands. An ancient wooden stake, darkened by time, with Latin inscriptions engraved on its surface. This stake was carved in 1695 from the wood of a tree that grew on consecrated ground, Sundström explained. It was blessed by Pope Innocent XII personally, when the Brotherhood sent a delegation to Rome seeking help. Legend says it's the only weapon that can truly destroy von Fersen, but it must pierce his heart during the hours between midnight and dawn, when his power is at its weakest. Inspector Lindqvist, a man of science and reason, found himself holding a vampire stake in his hands, seriously considering using it. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent his entire career solving crimes with forensic evidence and deductive logic, and now he was planning to hunt an immortal vampire with a piece of blessed wood. But the facts were undeniable. 2 women were dead, drained of blood in a way that no modern science could explain, and all paths of evidence led to a single impossible conclusion. "If we do this," Lindqvist said, his voice firm despite the surreal situation, "we'll need a plan. Von Fersen has survived for 3 centuries because he's smarter than all of us. But he makes one mistake." He looked up at the expectant faces of the Brotherhood. "He always returns to the scene of his crimes, and I know exactly how to trap him." The plan he was about to propose was bold, dangerous, and probably suicidal, but it was their only chance. The plan was simple but risky. The Brotherhood had documented that von Fersen visited his victims' homes during the 3 nights following each murder, apparently delighting in the scene of his crime. Helena Johansson's apartment, the second victim, would be watched throughout the night. Inspector Lindqvist and 4 members of the Brotherhood would hide inside, waiting for Von Fersen to appear.